Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. In the War of 1812, America proved to itself that it could go fight a significant enemy without totally folding. It was about that same time that the Federalist Party reached the opposite conclusion, as the Hartford Convention signified the last real moments of that first party system. The surviving party, the Democratic Republicans, or the Jeffersonian Democrats and the Jeffersonian Republicans, we've been over that, really didn't have any significant opposition to them. And some people characterize this time, without all of the partisanship fighting, as an era of good feelings, because some of the political discord seemed to kind of fall away. That's the subject of today. Turn with us now to those thrilling days of yesteryear, when out of the past come the thundering hoofbeats of Wahlberg's APUSH. History class rides again! We have three objectives today. By the end of this period, you should be able to identify the social basis for the flourishing democracy in the early, mid-19th century. 12, you should be able to describe the efforts made in this period to strengthen the economic integration of the nation and to identify the major crises that hindered those efforts. And number 13, you should be able to identify the major areas of conflict between nationalism and sectionalism, which sounds like an awful lot of conflict for a time known as an era of good feelings. But let's begin in Roman numeral number 11. Here I want to introduce a French person to you, a Frenchman named Alcide de Tocqueville. And de Tocqueville was a French aristocrat who was very interested in the American system. And today we might characterize de Tocqueville as a political scientist, although that term didn't really exist back then. And he was a French diplomat and historian who toured the United States to go study this model of American democracy. It was about in 1815, France's fragile republic, that, piece that they had fought the French Revolution for, collapsed. It collapsed in 1815 as Louis XVIII was restored to the throne. That Bourbon Restoration monarchy collapsed again in 1830 with the July Revolution, and that was the Second Republic of French history. And then this republic and monarchy would go back and forth a couple of times, and I think we might call it a tumultuous time in France. But meanwhile, Alcide de Tocqueville is watching what's going on in America and saying they don't seem to have the same turmoil and collapse that we're having back in France, and he was really interested in studying why. And so he came to the United States to go study our fledgling republic. He was particularly impressed with America's commitment to equality, that there was no understanding of a class or aristocratic system. But he was worried that maybe Americans overvalued individualism, that American spirit of everybody making their own bacon. De Tocqueville wanted to know if that was really going to be a long-term plan. The risk was that you could end up with a tyranny of the majority. And what happens if a lot of people have a bad idea or shout down opposing minority views? Or what if they overran individual rights because the mob was demanding so much of it? Tocqueville was particularly impressed by what he saw in American life, admiring the stability of the American economy and the popularity of its churches. And those things just didn't look like they were happening in the cities of France. He noted that while Americans were talking a strong game about freedom and equality, there was a real mistreatment of Native Americans, and that America was so willing to embrace slavery. Subpoint B. In 1840, about 90% of white men were eligible to vote. So by mid-19th century, nearly 90% of white men had the franchise. And democratic and political institutions came to define what it means to be an American. Since America doesn't have a territorial history at this point in our age, we're a country of ideas. We're a concept of philosophy. And that's the way that Americans began thinking themselves. To be an American was wrapped up in the idea of democracy. With the persistent pressure, though, that were excluded from political participation, and 90% of white men had the eligibility to vote, but that means an awful lot of people don't. There was this constant pressure for white males, the constant persistent pressure for those excluded from participation. Democracy was still triumphing by the time of the age of Andrew Jackson, whom we'll talk about more in a future episode. Subpoint C. We've identified so far an American political revolution, a market revolution, and an industrial revolution. Here I think there's one that doesn't get as much play as those others, but I think is worth discussing: an information revolution. The market revolution and growing political democracy produced an expansion in the public sphere at the same time that printing was expanding quite rapidly. It's an era of the penny press, these newspapers that were cheap, tabloid-style newspapers mass-produced in the United States from the 1830s and onwards. Mass production of inexpensive newspapers became possible following the shift from handcrafted printing presses to steam-powered printing. This penny press emphasized sensationalism and crime stories and exposés, and it's quite a tabloid style of journalism. But it brought with it reductions in printing costs, and that reductions in printing costs made possible alternative papers where minority positions might also get play. Those of black people and labor rights and abolitionists suddenly had some access to some mass media. Roman numeral number 12. Fighting the War of 1812 to a draw led to a burst of national pride and Americans believing that we could kind of do whatever it was that our hearts were set on. A new manufacturing sector emerged from that War of 1812, and a lot of people believe that this new manufacturing sector was a necessary complement to the agricultural sector for national growth. The old Jeffersonian ideal of the agrarian future now needed to be, in the eyes of many, accompanied with it a manufacturing and a production vision. By 1815, President James Madison put forward a blueprint for the government-promoted economic ideology that became known as the American system. The American systems had roots back in the old Hamiltonian ideas, which Madison then opposed, but now that he's president, sees some value in it. They included things like a new national bank. The National Bank had been allowed to expire by Madison just before the War of 1812, and once he'd fought a war, said, yeah, I wish we had a national bank. They would also have new tariffs. The tariffs then would protect American industry, but also raise funds for the government, and federal financing for internal improvements, things like roads and canals to continue the infrastructure of the country. President Madison came to believe that individual liberty was being threatened, and so even though Congress takes the idea of this American system and puts it forward, then Madison begins to think, I don't know, maybe some of these proposals aren't really the best, and maybe I don't like the way that Congress has put them out, so he begins vetoing some of these issues. Madison, it's always worth remembering, is a man of the details. He loves minutia, and if things just aren't right, he's not going to embrace them. Subpoint B. Henry Clay of Kentucky. We've met Henry Clay before. He was part of the Warhawks. Henry Clay of Kentucky led the National Republicans, and in 1816 he sponsored legislation that recreated the national bank, bringing back the Hamiltonian model. This one is the second bank of the United States, and Clay successfully persuaded Madison to go sign that legislation. The Bank of the United States, this second bank, was a profit-making corporation to serve the government. So it was a bank that was going to operate like a business. Bank of the United States branches were located in several states, so it's one bank of the government, but there's branches around in different states. Local banks, and remember, there's also local banks that are just operating like a business. Local banks were the ones that were printing money. This may surprise moderns today that think like, well, I have my bank account at Commerce Bank or Capital Federal, and they don't print money that I use, but it was the model of banking at the time. And they were the ones out printing currency. And the value of that currency, with all of the different banks in printing it, it's no surprise to me that it fluctuated wildly. The Bank of the United States was supposed to prevent the overissuance of currency, to say that well, what happens if Goliath National Bank is just printing too much cash? And the Bank of the United States was supposed to standardize all of that because it could demand loans, it could demand its payment from loans in actual gold or actual silver, not just printed currency. Subpoint C. A lot of people oppose the Bank of the United States for a variety of reasons. Remember, banking is not overall an industry that everyone loves in this era. While we are getting more comfortable with the idea of modern banking, there is a certain suspicion of the banking class it was seen as, and a lot of people opposed it for a lot of different reasons, including the belief, not about banking itself, but of a political science function, that it was just an improper tool of the federal government, that just governments shouldn't be involved in the shuffling of money. The Maryland legislature adopted an act which would impose a tax on all banks operating in the state of Maryland that weren't chartered specifically by the state legislature. So if I open a bank, it's the Bank of Wahlberg, and it had a branch in Maryland, even though that, like, you know, I'm operating in my home state, if it had a branch in Maryland, then that Maryland branch would be subject to the tax. However, if the Bank of Wahlberg was chartered in Maryland to begin with, then it would not be subject. It's sort of a banking tariff, although that's not exactly the way to look at it. So the Maryland legislature adopts this tax, and then they say, Bank of the United States, you weren't chartered by the Maryland legislature, and so you have to go pay the tax. And so the bank refused. And so a cashier for the Bank of the United States, and cashier, don't think of like the teller in the booth, but cashier is a more technical position of banking in this day. The cashier of the Bank of the United States refused to go pay that tax, a guy named James McCulloch. And when he refused to go pay the tax, he was sued by the state of Maryland for not complying with the state tax rules of the state. McCulloch admitted that he wasn't complying with Maryland law. His specific guilt was never actually in question. The question was whether or not the tax was a fair tax. And so when he was sued, he lost in the Baltimore County Court. That's not really a surprise there that a county in Maryland would uphold the Maryland position against the federal bank when the Bank of the United States is admitting that they're not paying the tax. That decision was affirmed by the Maryland Court of Appeals. The Bank of the United States appealed it to the Maryland Court of Appeals and said, no, this is an unfair tax. Maryland Court of Appeals upheld the Baltimore County decision. The case was taken up then by the United States Supreme Court with the question, does Congress have the authority to establish a Bank of the United States under the Constitution? This case that comes up, McCulloch versus Maryland, while yes, it is about taxing the bank, is really a greater question of, does Congress even have the authority to create a Bank of the United States? And Chief Justice John Marshall, and it's no surprise it's Marshall, he wrote the unanimous opinion for the court. He writes that Article 1, Section 8 of the American Constitution gives Congress the power to make all laws necessary and proper to go carry out Congress's powers. This is known as the Necessary and Proper Clause. Sometimes political scientists also refer to it as the elastic clause because it stretches out Congress's ability. But using the Hamiltonian idea of the broad constitution of the broad construction of the Constitution, and Hamilton's not a member of Congress at this point. He's dead, and he's not a member of the Supreme Court because he's dead. But he was one of the authors of the Federalist Papers that gives the Supreme Court kind of an understanding of the way the Constitution should be interpreted. So Hamilton proposes this broad construction of the Constitution, and using that, John Marshall wrote, "Let the end be legitimate." So if Congress is making laws, the end law needs to be a legitimate law. Let it be within the scope of the Constitution, and by all means are appropriate. Unless they're prohibited, they are constitutional. So John Marshall says, the Second Bank of the United States, it's a real bank, it's a constitutional bank. The bank then was a lawful instrument of a specific federal authority, and so creating the Bank of the United States was constitutional. Furthermore, in McCulloch versus Maryland, we go to Article 4 of the Constitution, and there it says that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and anything in the laws of the states contrary, notwithstanding, the Constitution, the federal government, is the supreme law of the land. And since, this is a great line, and libertarians love it today, they say, since the power to tax is the power to destroy, then the states have no power by taxation or otherwise to retard, to impede, or to control federal laws. So, Maryland, while you wish you could go tax this Bank of the United States, which you don't believe in, and go tax it maybe even to the point of destroying the bank, you don't have the authority to do that because the state cannot crush an initiative of the federal government. Thus, the law imposing a tax on the Bank of the United States is unconstitutional and void. McCulloch versus Maryland is our second Supreme Court case that we're going to lean on that shows how the federal government takes power away from the states and asserts the supremacy of the state or of the national constitution. Subpoint D. The Bank of the United States was participating, like a lot of the rest of America, in a speculative fever that swept the country after the War of 1812. Speculation is a term that we've used a couple of times before, but just to make sure we're up to speed on it, speculation is it's a business practice, it's an economic practice when buyers buy something with the hope of selling it later. Like you could speculate on war bonds, that you're going to buy this war bond with the hope of selling it later. You could speculate on land, hoping to get a lot of land to go sell it at a profit later. It's a type of economic gambling. It doesn't always pay off. The Bank of the United States, like a lot of banks were, was participating in this speculation as well. Early in 1819, though, European demand for American farm products was dropping. During the Napoleonic Wars and the years afterwards, it was hard to grow. Farming just wasn't a priority back in Europe, and so American exports were booming. But by 1819, the dust had settled in Europe, and a lot of that demand was declining, and so American farm products were returning. The speculative fever kind of dried up as the economic bubble burst. Demand for land and prices fell. That's not an unusual pattern after wars, but demand for land and prices fell. And when that happened, both the Bank of the United States as well as all the state banks, they quickly began calling in loans to go make sure that they could have resources, cash in their vault to go pay for all of their obligations. So they said, hey, you owe us money. We need that money back. That's called calling in a loan. They demanded repayment before the loan collateral lost all of its value. If you had gone and put up your farm as a guarantee of your loan, and then suddenly the farm is worth a lot less money, the bank says, hey, you got to pay us back because this collateral is no longer securing your loan. That's part of the way the banks call in loans. The Panic of 1819 that resulted disrupted the political harmony of the previous years, and it reinforced American distrust of banks, thinking that, man, you think you can do business with a bank, and then suddenly they're going to demand the money that they've loaned you for a term. Subpoint E. Here I want to give this title, The Missouri Crisis. The Missouri Crisis of 1819-1821. Boy, it seems like all of Missouri is a crisis, isn't it? James Monroe's 2 terms of president were characterized by the absence of two-party competition. This is known as the era of good feelings. There just basically wasn't a political competition. But the absence of political party disputes was replaced with a different kind of acrimony, that of sectional disputes. Questions of north and south, or east of the Appalachian Mountains and west of the Appalachian Mountains. There's this sectional dispute in different sections of the country. When Missouri applied for admission to the Union as a slave state in 1819, Congressman James Talmadge of New York proposed a ban on the importation of slaves into Missouri and a gradual emancipation of the slaves that were there. Missouri white people rejected Talmadge's proposals, and when that happened, the northern majority in the House of Representatives said, well, we're just not going to allow Missouri to come into the Union because we don't want a slave state there. We gave you the terms by which Missouri could come in, and if you reject them, then I guess you reject them. To underline their commitment to slavery, Southerners used their power in the Senate, and in the Senate, they held half of the seats. They withdrew statehood from Maine, and they withheld statehood from Maine. They said, well, Maine wanted to become a state as well, and if you're not going to allow Missouri as a slave state, then we're not going to allow Maine as a free state. Maine had previously belonged to Massachusetts, and they were trying to spin off and be their own state from there. Southerners, in their arguments, made 3 constitutional claims. First, they raised the principle of equal rights for the state, saying that just because there's a northern majority that doesn't like slave states, all the states are equal, slave or free, and you can't just go around pushing, throwing your weight in the House of Representatives just because you have a few more people there. They also argued that slavery was an internal state affair, and they say, if you don't like slaves, don't have one, right? And so this is a matter of southern states, and if they want to have slavery, and if Missouri wants to have slavery, that's a slave state issue. That's a state issue. It's not an issue for the Congress to go get involved with. And third, they mentioned that Congress, and here's the kicker, had no authority to infringe on the property rights of slaveholders. They said that Congress can't just go take away property from people just because they don't like the property. If the state allows slavery as property, then the federal government can't just go seize them because they disagree with the ownership. Henry Clay put together a series of political agreements known as the Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise set a precedent for admission to the states of the Union. They would come in pairs. Henry Clay becomes known as the Great Compromiser because he could get people to work together in their interests, even if neither interest was really satisfied. And the Missouri Compromise said any states come into the Union need a buddy on the opposite side of slavery. So if Missouri wants to come in as slave, then Maine can come in as free. But they can't do one without the other. Southern senators accepted the legislation, and they prohibited slavery. Southern senators accepted the legislation. That legislation also prohibited slavery in most of Louisiana Purchase. Basically, they drew a line across the country that's the 36-30-degree line, which is essentially the southern edge of Missouri. They said everything from there down will be slave states. As they come in, everything above it can be free states. And Missouri is kind of the wonky one because it's part of the deal. Missouri could just be above the line, and we'll just accept that as the line of latitude. The Missouri debate highlighted that the westward expansion of slavery was a passionate topic that would eventually prove hazardous to national unity. The task of reconciling the regional differences had become difficult. It just wasn't easy to bring people together, and the specter of civil war was lurking in the background. Roman numeral number 13. Now here we're going to get into some questions of nation, section, and party as they break down. Because the United States and Latin America, the United States had its War of Independence, and then Latin America was going through similar questions on how long Spain was going to hold that territory. And between the years of 1810 and 1822, Spain's Latin American colonies rose up in rebellion against their crown, establishing 17 different independent nations in that 12-year period. In 1822, the Monroe administration became the first government to go extend diplomatic recognition to those new republics. There's always this question when a country splits off if they're going to be a legitimate country or not. And Monroe's America was the first one to say, yes, legitimate countries. We see a little bit of our independence movement in the Latin American movements. These wars of independence, though, were different than the American Revolution. They lasted longer and were far more destructive than the American Revolution. It was very difficult to achieve economic development once they were free. In a lot of ways, the Spanish colonial model just didn't set up future success and independence the same way that the English model did. And fearing that Spain would go retake its colonies and capitalize on a floundering economy and the political turmoil of independence, Secretary of State John Quincy Adams drafted the Monroe Doctrine. So John Quincy Adams writes it, but Monroe's the one that promulgates it, so we call it the Monroe Doctrine. And the Monroe Doctrine, remember this, it's important. It says that American continents, North or South America, and all the countries on each were not subject to future colonization. In return, the United States agreed that we would not interfere in the internal concerns of European nations. Essentially, Europe, you stay on your side of the Atlantic, we'll stay on our side of the Atlantic. You don't make any colonies in North or South America over here. This is going to be a colonial-free land, and we'll stay out of your business over there. Subpoint B. 1824 is an election year, and it happens as the Federalist Party has essentially collapsed. The decline of the Federalists and party politics meant that there was less partisan fighting between two different parties. The Republican Party, though, was divided. The remnants of what was the Jeffersonian Republican Democrats, it was divided now into a nationalist faction and a Jeffersonian faction. The nationalist faction was led by Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams, that was thinking of America as a whole, that the country should operate as a united nation. And then there was the Republican, the Jeffersonian side, which was the state-oriented faction. That's got Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren, two people who are going to get very important to our story. The election of 1824 had 5 candidates, and they all called themselves members of the Republican Party. It had John Quincy Adams, John C. Calhoun, William H. Crawford, Henry Clay, and Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was the only candidate in 1824 to have a national appeal. Everybody knew Andy Jackson as the colonel and the hero of the Battle of New Orleans. Congress, though, selected William Crawford as the official candidate, but the other candidates refused to accept that selection and say, well, Congress doesn't get to pick this thing, and they sought support among ordinary voters. The John Quincy Adams campaign centered on his success and his experience as Secretary of State. But John Quincy Adams was a guy that knew the rest of the world and was a successful administrator and successful government bureaucrat. Henry Clay promoted the American system, saying that he was the one that was forwarding the American economy. Crawford was advocating adherence to the Jeffersonian ideal, saying that no, the state rights position and the small local government, that was the Crawford position. John C. Calhoun said, I'm probably not viable in this election, and he withdrew and said, everybody that would have supported me, I want you to go support Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson ran on his ability as a war hero and as a self-made rags-to-riches man. Although Andrew Jackson received nationwide support, no candidate actually had enough support to go achieve a majority in the Electoral College. So when you can't achieve a majority in the Electoral College, it gets kicked to the House of Representatives to go choose the president. Henry Clay was a member of the House of Representatives, and he assembled a coalition which said, okay, I'm probably not viable myself, but and this nationalist faction would go support John Quincy Adams. And so he urged his congressman to go vote for John Quincy Adams. And John Quincy Adams says, once I win office, I'm going to turn around and thank you, Clay, for your support and go repay him by appointing you to be Secretary of State. Clay's appointment was a political fatality to both men. Essentially, it looked like it was a cooked, corrupt deal. And John C. Calhoun, who was not in this deal, accused Henry Clay and accused John Quincy Adams of using power and patronage of the executive to go thwart the popular will, and this should have been a vote of, the support of Congress and not the machinations of politics. And Jacksonians in Congress, they condemned Henry Clay. They called it the corrupt bargain, and that's a term that still survives today. The corrupt bargain put John Quincy Adams in the White House and Henry Clay in the Secretary of State. You might argue that this isn't actual corruption. This is just the way politics works on the inside, but it sure smelled awful bad. Subpoint C. John Quincy Adams, before he became president, was probably the single most qualified person ever for the presidency. He had been a Secretary of State. He'd been a diplomat. The Battle of Bunker Hill was literally fought in his yard. He was, as a young boy, essentially a veteran of the Revolution. He served overseas. He'd been a diplomat to France and to Russia. He helped his dad negotiate the deal in France. And he comes into the presidency perhaps more qualified than any person ever has become president. And Adams embraced Henry Clay's American system. Things like protective tariffs and federally subsidized transportation improvements, and also securing up that national bank. John Quincy Adams' policies favored the business elite of the Northeast and the entrepreneurs and the commercial farmers in the Midwest. But honestly, he had little support among the Southern planters and the smallholding farmers who feared powerful banks and opposed inflation that would have resulted from tariffs. Congress approved really only a few of John Quincy Adams' proposals for those internal improvements. While Adams was advocating a stronger infrastructure, Congress didn't follow him into the deal. The short extension of the national road, politicians believe that those kinds of things should really be prerogatives of the state, not of the federal government. The most far-reaching battle of the Adams administration came over the question of tariffs. John Quincy Adams' tariff of 1824, it protected manufacturers in New England and Pennsylvania against imports of woolen and cloth textiles, as well as iron goods. Tariffs have that way of raising money. It is a tax, but they also have a way of changing how industries work, and some people thought that that's just an unfair use of the tax system. Disregarding Southern opposition to it, Northern Jacksonians joined with supporters of Adams and Clay to enact that tariff in 1828. That raised the taxes on raw materials, on textiles, on iron goods, those things coming into America. The new tariffs, though, enraged the South because they were the world's cheapest producer of raw cotton. And then, tariffs work that when somebody puts when you put a tariff on another country, they get reciprocal tariffs. And the South said, hey, we do business with the rest of the world and you're just dumping new tariffs on us. And that cost Southern planters about $100 million a year because they either had to go buy higher cost American textiles or iron goods or highly taxed British goods as well. Southerners thought the tariff seemed like legalized pillage. There's just a way of trying to go exploit the Southern dependents. And they called it the Tariff of Abominations. That's a great term for the tariff of 1828. John Quincy Adams was really kind of the last of his era, of these elitist politicians. He just refused to adjust to the style of party politics and changing practices and ways. And John Quincy Adams, while he's an interesting fellow, is probably not long for the presidency because he just doesn't understand the changes that are afoot in the political nature. Those changes are going to play out in 100 different ways, and I can't wait to tell you about it. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.